think, entirely true. That Catholicism is obviously a very unique religion, but unique in a very positive way. And there really is nothing out there like Catholicism. And that's seen best in comparing it to other world religions and other faiths. So I'm going to do that. In doing so, I do not, just as a disclaimer, I don't mean to denigrate other religions or anything like that, but I want to show you the ways that I think Catholicism is both unique and strongly unique, and unique in a very positive sense. And I can only do that by comparing. So, no right from the front that I'm not trying to criticize Hinduism or anything like that, but I will necessarily draw these comparisons. So, as I mentioned, there are a number of elements that make Catholicism unique. And the first one, and I think maybe the most foundational one, is the way that we are oriented towards truth, or the way even that we conceive of truth. In Catholicism, what is going on? This is like a preschooler stampede.
They're fine.
Yeah. Much more interesting than I am. But in Catholicism, truth is truth. Truth is something that's independent from the source. It's something independent from the bearer of that truth. Truth is a quality of the thing itself, and not a quality of the source or the one who mentions it. So, for example, the fact that a toddler says, say, 2 + 2 = 4. Well, that is just as true as if that statement were uttered by a mathematics professor. It doesn't become more true with the degrees, the number of degrees of the person who's saying it. So truth is truth. It's objective, it's out there, it doesn't depend on the source. And because Catholicism believes this, it opens up a number of points. It means that in Catholicism, we can find truth out in the world and then incorporate it into our own belief and practice. It gives us an openness to the world, an openness to, in some senses, other religions, where we borrow things and then baptize them, or other philosophies, other organizations, other ways of doing things, other forms of art, architecture, music, all of these different things. Catholicism is open to that because we know that in every culture there are good things that can be had, things that we can take and incorporate into our own belief. And this is particularly important to us because in Catholicism, or this is true of Christianity in general, we believe that Jesus ultimately is the truth. In John's Gospel, at the very beginning, John said, Jesus is truth. He is truth. And so insofar as we are pursuing truth, truly pursuing truth, we are pursuing Jesus. Even if we know it, whether we know it or not, we are pursuing it because Jesus is ultimate truth. And so this is why we are so open to truth wherever we find it, because it's not only benefits us, not only helps us grow and develop, but because Jesus is truth. And so that openness isn't just an openness to things that we can learn from other cultures, other people, other time periods, but this is an openness to what we can learn from Jesus himself. So that attitude towards truth is somewhat rare, actually, in world religions. A lot of other world religions would claim that this is syncretism, that if you are borrowing some practice, say, that originated with pagans, or at least that pagans celebrated, that somehow it's corrupt, you can't touch it. Now, I've noticed this standard, which that criticism is made not only by, say, other Christian denominations, sometimes more fundamentalist denominations made of Catholicism, but it's also made of Islam, or made from Islam as a general critique of all Christianity, Catholic and Protestant. It's a charge that is made by a lot of different groups, and it's generally made unevenly because the people who are making that charge themselves practice something that was taken from some other pagan religion or something like that. In Catholicism, there's no problem with this. I'll give you I think 2 examples. One very good one, but the first is this. When we talked about church history, we talked about how when Catholicism became public in the mid to late Roman Empire, when it became legalized under Constantine, Catholicism, or Catholics then kind of flooded the public square. And over time, by the end of the 4th century, Catholics were actually involved in all kinds of things, and that was kind of the in religion. And so Catholics took over a lot of the old pagan temples, and then took out all the pagan statues and replaced them with Christian or Catholic statues. Well, here's an example of taking a pagan practice, the use of statues in a worship space, and putting a Christian, filling it up kind of with Christian wine. So you're using an old wineskin, you're filling it with new wine. And the Catholics would look at this. They said, the pagans have this insight that we are not alone when we are here worshiping, that there are others watching us. Now, of course, we rejected the idea that these other pagan deities, Artemis is not watching us, right? Ares is not watching us. But the saints are watching us. God is watching us. The angels are watching us. Hebrews, the author of Hebrews mentions this great cloud of witnesses watching us run the race. So these statues remind us that we have family from this long church family that stretches into the past, and also reminds us in a special way that this family also continues into the future. So there's a practice that's baptized, unique to Catholics and Orthodox, and of course some Episcopalian churches, of course, have statues as well. But here's a more fundamental one, and that is the Trinity. I mean, we borrowed Greek philosophy to understand the very heart and nature of God, the Trinity, that God is triune. Now, Greek philosophy was not Catholic by any stretch. I mean, obviously, it preceded Catholicism by a number of centuries, but the point is that it had no natural connection with Catholicism. But it provided a way of understanding what this Trinity is, these three personas, using the old Greek persona, in one God. How are we supposed to understand this? It seemed nonsensical. Well, Greek philosophy actually helped us understand it. And so all Christians owe a debt to Greek philosophy in understanding the very nature of God. There's another example of taking some truth found somewhere else, another culture and another religion, in fact, but something that sheds light on our own faith. And so this is part of this kind of quilt of truths that we go out and find, and we put them together and we baptize them so that they're consistent with Catholicism, and they shed light on our faith and help us to grow and develop. That's why Catholicism has developed so quickly. That's why it could go from a oppressed religion in the first 3 centuries AD into, within, say, 800 years, this major world power. I mean, this is what led to the Renaissance. This is what led to all of these huge, sudden, explosive advances in Europe at the time. It wasn't the Europeans. Those people, those were barbarian tribes that came over. These people were illiterate. It was the Catholic faith and its openness to truth that converted those barbarians into this kind of civilization where you could have all kinds of science and art and architecture and all of those kinds of advances. Ultimately, it's Catholicism's approach to truth that allowed for that. So that's quite unique among world religions. Catholicism is also historically grounded. If you look at another religion, and I don't mean to pick on Hinduism at all, but unfortunately it just happens to be the case that I'm going to mention Hinduism a number of times. But if you look at something like, for example, Hinduism has a very, very deep, rich mythology. Quite interesting, actually, for anyone interested in looking at it. But it's a very interesting kind of epic collection of epic stories. But there isn't any real sense in Hinduism, at least these days, that these stories actually took place. I mean, you'll find people, of course, who think that this is kind of literal truth. But for the most part, these are kind of fading into the golden haze of mythology. And so they don't really even necessarily claim to be describing real things. Now contrast that with Catholicism. In Catholicism, we claim that certain things actually occurred in history, certain monumental things. Specifically, most importantly, that God became man, that God suffered, died, and through his power rose again from the dead, and actually in doing so destroyed death for those who would accept him. Well, this is not a gauzy mythological claim. This is a claim that something occurred in history 2,000 years ago. That if you were able to hop into a time machine and go back to, say, 33 AD, thereabouts, and get out and look, you would see something. I mean, I don't know exactly what you would see, but you would certainly see something. You would know that something monumental happened, because this actually happened in history. That's a very unique approach in religion. You'll see some of that in Islam. In fact, you see a fair bit of it in Islam. You'll see some of it in Judaism, although as the generations pass in Judaism, that seem to be kind of moving away from that idea that the Old Testament is a real history of the people. So it's a little bit different. But really only Islam has that in common. And what this claim to historicity, or this claim to be historically grounded, what this does in Catholicism is it leads to this confidence among Catholics, where we say, look, we can demonstrate aspects of our religion through study, through history, through philosophy, through logic, reason. We can't, not entirely of our faith, I mean, this comes by the grace of God. But we can support quite strongly our faith through these studies. So we have no fear of investigating the claims that Catholicism makes, because ultimately, again, it goes back to truth. We're looking for truth. And so far as we're pursuing truth, we're pursuing God. So we have nothing to fear. There's never a point in Catholicism, and I can't underscore how important this is for people who question. All of us should question, but this is so important. There's never a point in your faith, your life as a Catholic, where you will have to say, you know what, I need to stop pursuing this line of question in my mind. I need to stop asking questions, because soon I'm going to question myself out of faith. You don't have that, because we don't fear questions. Questions are good, so long as you're honestly pursuing the truth, honestly pursuing the answer. So very different, very, very different attitude among world religions. Another one, this comes down to God. In Catholicism, in Christianity, God is personal. God is a personal being. This is dramatically different than what you would find in any other world religion. I can't think of any religion that would be anything close to this. And as I said, this one is true of Christianity, so this isn't exclusive to Catholicism. Of course, all Christian denominations recognize that God is a personal being. God knows you. God is intimate with you. He knows every aspect of your life, everything you've done and will do. God is more intimate with you than, of course, that you are with yourself. This is very different than, say, the God of, say, the Old Testament, or the God of Judaism, because Judaism only accepts the Old Testament, where God is a leader. God loves his people in this sense, but it's not a personal God. It's more kind of a tribal God in a sense. Tribal. That sounds like a slap against Judaism. I don't mean it to be so, but that's kind of what it is. It's a leader of this kind of ethnic group of people in the Middle East. Look at Islam. Well, this is not a personal God in Islam. And in fact, the Muslims would consider it extremely offensive, blasphemous, to claim that God is personal. Because God in Islam is completely transcendent. He's totally other from us. He doesn't understand what it is to be human, because that would be to lessen what God is. In polytheistic religions like Hinduism, we don't have personal gods, because we have many different gods. The same thing in ancient paganism, in ancient Greek religions. You had many gods. I mean, the gods were almost kind of human in a high school locker room kind of way, but they weren't personal. They weren't intimate with you. They didn't know what it was to suffer, to be alone, to die. All of those things, to feel abandoned. All of those things that God actually knows, because God became a man, a human, and suffered just as we do. So very, very different. The Christian God knows what it is to be us. Now, one of the things that I like about Catholicism, and maybe this is the, I don't know, the aesthete in me, or the bacchanalia, I don't know. But Catholicism says you can enjoy the good things of the world. We recognize that creation is good. You know, the world is damaged. It's been wounded by the fall, wounded by original sin, but it is still fundamentally good. And so we enjoy the good things of life. There's nothing wrong with enjoying the pleasures of life in moderation. That's the thing I'll come to in a second. But Catholics, we love our wine, we love our beer. We've got monasteries that create this stuff. Have a cigar if you want, dance, sing, jump up and down. Catholics are party people. I had to say it.
Don't apologize.
But that's the thing. We are not Puritans. We recognize that this created world is good. It's a beautiful place. we have art, we have music. We don't cut ourselves off from these things. And it's not only, it's not even a benefit just because, hey, it's great to be able to have a beer or a dance or sing. It's not even that. It's that cutting us off from those things is somehow to deprive us of an enjoyment that God gave to us. Now, there are exceptions here. Let me be very clear. Everything that we enjoy, all of those things I mentioned, and really just anything in general, we have to enjoy in moderation. All good things, but in moderation. In other words, when something becomes excessive, then it becomes a problem. If I like to dance, that's not a problem. That's great. But if I'm spending every night down in the club dancing to the detriment of my family, that's a problem because it's not done in moderation. Also, there's a problem. Some of us have addictions. All of us have some kind of addiction, something. But I'll give an example of myself. I have a horrible addiction to nicotine. Now, I haven't had nicotine in 6-7 years, something like that. But I cannot have a cigarette. I cannot sit in a bar with a friend and smoke a hookah, which has almost no nicotine in there, but there's a little bit, right? Because as soon as I get that in me, boom, right back to it. So for me, I can't, any experience of that is just, that's excess. I can't go there. I can't do that moderately. It's just not hard to get because that just happens to be, one of my big weaknesses. We all have things like that. And so where that overlaps into one of these things, then you really need to avoid those things. So that's just really common sense. But that does speak again to this attitude of Catholicism towards the world. The world isn't a bad place. We're not Puritans. We're not telling people to stop having fun. Fun is great. Fun came from God. But again, in moderation. We do it until it hurts us. In other words, once it crosses that line, then that's something that we need to avoid. It's a bad thing. Catholicism is uniquely, now I'm back to Catholicism, is uniquely oriented towards charity. What do I mean by that? Well, the biggest world welfare organization by far, it's not even close, is the Catholic Church. Number 2 is the Rotary International, which is fantastic. That's fantastic, but that's way down the list here. Now, why is it? Is it just that, hey, Catholics just happen to be great people, and it's a big religion. It's 1/5 or so of the world's population, so that would make sense. Well, not really. The reason why we have this ongoing orientation towards charity, this fact that we've been doing this for now 2,000 years, because it started way back. This is first century stuff, is because it's part of our religion to be so. Our religion is based on God's gift to an undeserving humanity, where He suffered and gave His life. The Father gave the life of His Son to save us, even though we didn't deserve it. It was this gift. And so it's part of our faith to kind of have that same orientation towards others. And so we have a religious obligation to care for the poor. We have a religious obligation to care for those who are cast out, the lonely, and the lowly, and those who are not of a high state in life. This is a religious obligation. This is something that we do out of love, because these people are suffering in a way that we can help alleviate. So this is something big, and in helping them, of course, that's an expression of our own love. Well, now compare that, for example, to Hinduism. I'm so sorry, Hinduism. Compare that to Hinduism, and I chose Hinduism specifically because of the idea of karma. Karma, if you're not familiar with the term karma, this isn't exclusive to Hinduism, but that's the primary religion that kind of carries this doctrine. But it's the belief that our state in life, the way that we were born, physically, socially, all of those things, is determined not by chance, but actually by our behaviors in another life. So we're reincarnated. And so in an earlier life, if I'm born with, say, crippled, and it was because in an earlier life I was a real jerk. And so this is kind of justice. And when you think of it, when you say it in a very general sense, you can see, okay, well, maybe, But then you think of it in that way. What does this do to charity? Why would you help the cripple? Why would you help someone born blind if you believe that that person's blind because they were a jerk in an earlier life and they're getting their comeuppance? Well, good for them. Yeah, get what they deserve. Well, charity goes right out the window. Doesn't mean that you cannot be compassionate as a Hindu or a proponent of reincarnation or karma. Sure, you can, absolutely. But it does not come out of the belief. It's something that is in contradiction to your belief. So Catholics don't have that. We are oriented towards charity, love, all of these things because it is part of our faith. The world is as we encounter it for the most part. Suffering is not an illusion. If someone is suffering, it's because they're suffering. It's not their fault because they were jerks in an earlier life. And we have an obligation to help alleviate that where we can. Now, the interesting thing is that the next item seems like a contradiction. It seems like I'm about to contradict everything I just said, but I'm not. And that's this. In Catholicism, suffering is redemptive. Suffering is redemptive. Now let me explain this. In the modern world, we see this all over the place. So much of the modern world is tuned to the idea that we have to eliminate every aspect of suffering from the human condition completely. And so we have an epidemic of painkiller use. But not just that. We have this breakneck attempt to find some kind of diet you can lose weight, but it's not actually hard. You don't actually have to really put in a lot of work. Or you can, you can have these cures for diseases, but it's not really that hard. And you can do all of these different things without really putting in any kind of pain, because pain is worthless. You want to get rid of all pain from your life. I mean, it's kind of a modern thought that the perfect life is one where you've gotten rid of all pain and suffering, and you're just happy all the time. Well, this comes from an idea that suffering is just meaningless and something that you need to eliminate all the time because it's never good. It's never beneficial. But in fact, suffering is beneficial in certain situations if it's recognized. Suffering brings us into contact with God. It makes us intimate with God because God suffered. And in suffering, God became most like a human being. God created this kind of bridge between us and Him. In suffering, we can unite with God in His own expression of love when He was on earth, because His expression of love, the way He showed us His love most pointedly, was by suffering. So suffering for the Catholic is not a bad thing. It's not something you want to promote. And as I just said, we try to relieve suffering where we can, especially through the suffering of poverty and loneliness and all those things. But just because we try to do that, and just because we know that God is good and loves us, doesn't mean that we won't ourselves go through periods of suffering. We absolutely will. This gets back to something I said at the first or second session, where I mentioned that when we change, when we grow, when we develop, we have to die to ourselves. That old person that we're growing away from dies. We experience that as a real death, even if it leads to something magnificent. And it's like this, I love this story. Back in, this was years ago, shortly after I got out of college, I was taking a drive with a friend of mine. We were going on a road trip up to Boston. And I was kind of going through personal turmoil, as kids right out of college do. And so we're driving, and I'm just kind of quiet, and he's got the music playing. And then he kind of looks over at me, and he stops, and he leans forward and turns the music off. He said, "Brian, have you ever grown personally where you haven't suffered, in that process?" And I thought, no. He said, "Well, have you ever suffered where you haven't, as a result, grown in that experience?" I said, "No, I haven't done that either." And he goes, leans forward, turns the music back. Now, that was one of the great lessons of my life, actually, because in just one life, he doesn't even remember this today. I tell him, he's like, "I was so smart." But he instinctively realized that there is good that comes out of suffering. We learn in suffering. Growth is suffering. All of these things come out of suffering. So suffering is not always a bad thing. Alleviate it in others, but when it comes, sometimes it's just going to come. It's going to come to every one of us. Now compare this to, say, the philosophy of say, Buddhism. In Buddhism, you have a number of tenets of Buddhism where it kind of starts off. But the idea in Buddhism is that all life is suffering. And the idea, the goal of life is to eliminate that suffering, or at least eliminate the ways that that suffering impacts you. Suffering in Buddhism comes from desire. And so you eliminate your desire so you can eliminate suffering. The idea there is that suffering is just, it should always be eliminated. You know, every step we take needs to be painless. The world needs to be padded. Well, of course, that's not the way that we see suffering. So suffering is redemptive. That's a very, very uniquely Catholic view. It's true to some degree in some other Christian denominations, but really not to the level that we have it in Catholicism. Catholicism is universal. It's in the very name. It comes from the Greek Catholicos, universal. There is no religion that is universal in this way. Catholicism is this combination of Middle Eastern religion, thought, history, North African philosophy and theology, Roman organization, Greek logic, Far Eastern, possibly Far Eastern prayer methods, at least in the modern era. I mean, it combines all of these things in a way that no other religion does. I mean, Catholicism, and every country has its own kind of expression, every culture rather has its own unique expression of Catholicism, but we all share the same beliefs. There's nothing like this. If you look at Islam, Islam is inseparable from Arab nomadic culture. The Quran is written in Arabic, and it's considered only to be inspired in that Arabic original because they believe that the angel Gabriel, this was actually God's word that he communicated, and then Gabriel repeated to Muhammad. So in that way, you can't separate it from Muslim culture. Hinduism, with the mythology, I mean, you cannot separate Hinduism from Indian history and Indian mythology. I mean, this is, you can't do it. You can't have a real Hinduism. You can't have American Hinduism, You can have American Hindus, but you can't have American Hinduism. Same thing with Judaism. Judaism is ethnic, and that's proudly proclaimed. That's not a slight at all. But in fact, it's ethnic. It's the people, the tribe of Israel, the people of God. So there are no other religions that have this kind of universality. Catholicism does, not because we're great or special or anything like that, but because, again, we have that that very first thing I talked about. We're open to truth wherever it is. And the last one, there are many I could go through, but I've just isolated a few. But the last one is this: Catholicism is growing. And I do not mean numerically, although it is growing numerically. We have this idea in the United States, but even more in Europe, that Catholicism is shrinking. It's somehow on the wane. The churches in Europe are empty, and churches in the United States are, maybe not all empty, but some. We have this idea that it's kind of on the way out. Well, that's a very exclusively Western perspective. It's absolutely true that Catholicism in Europe is kind of on the decline. I mean, you have the advance of secularism, that's true. In some circles in the United States, that's true as well. But that certainly isn't true when you step back and look at the whole world. Catholicism is exploding in Asia. It's absolutely exploding in Africa. About 10 years ago, and I don't know what the statistic is right now, but about 10 years ago, you had about 3,000 new Catholics a day in Africa. 3,000 new Catholics a day. Within 100 years, the Catholic Church is going to look very, very different. It's going to be a very different church. It's a growing church. And so it is growing numerically, but that actually isn't the way I mean growing. So we've got, the numbers are fine, but we don't want to be, I'm not rah-rahing this last one. When I say growing, I mean this, that Catholicism recognizes that there's a certain core to our religion, the creed, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, that set of core beliefs. That set of beliefs is timeless and unchanging. That's a communication, that's part of the deposit of faith. It's this communication from God to humanity. about the truth of God. That is stable and unchanging. But over the centuries, our understanding of that may clarify. We may learn new things, whatever, science, textual criticism, all of these different fields, new ways of expressing ideas through art, music, etc., that we can then apply to that unchanging deposit of faith to better understand it. This is why Catholicism has grown and developed over the centuries, grown in some magnificent ways, but that core belief has never changed. Because that core of our belief, what we call dogma, doctrine, those things haven't changed. And so Catholicism has that framework. We have this kind of protection where we recognize that time and study and prayer and reflection, all of these things can lead us to better understand these things that are there. But we also have this kind of tether, this thing that keeps us grounded to the original, the truth, the core of our belief. Compare that to some religions, for example, modern-day Judaism, where in many circles, obviously you have different forms of Judaism, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, etc. But in many forms, especially kind of more modern liberal Judaism, and even in some conservative Jewish synagogues these days, I mean, there's really it's almost like an agnosticism. You know, it's the Jewish faith in those circles is almost treated like it's a cultural thing that keeps us all kind of together in this club, but we've kind of moved away from the religious claims. And that's because there was no tether, there was no framework where they could grow and develop without changing into something completely different. See, Catholicism has that. So we advance. Science doesn't bother us. Advances, new discoveries won't bother us. If we find a Martian out there somewhere, it's not going to disrupt our entire worldview. Compare that to some other religions that have trouble modernizing and developing and encountering the new world in a way that would not somehow undercut their own faith. So Catholicism is very different in that orientation as well. So I've talked about a whole bunch of different things, kind of bounced about, but try to connect them to show you that there really is nothing like Catholicism. And I don't say that in any kind of triumphalistic way, but simply because it's true. Catholicism is a unique religion. There's nothing, it's more than a religion, it's a worldview, it's a way of looking at reality. And I think that the richness that it has, the fact that it is so unique, and it so clearly speaks to things in our own heart that we encounter, or the challenges in our own lives that we encounter, I think that speaks to the truth of it. I think it makes sense. If this is in fact God's religion, this is exactly what we would expect to see. So, any questions? I'm always all over the place. So, any questions on anything, any of those things that I mentioned?